The silence of the North Sea is something that stays with you, even when you're thousands of miles away. For 18 months, that silence was my only companion. I worked as a deep-sea saturation diver, fixing oil pipelines in pitch-black water, freezing temperatures and crushing pressure. Every time I descended into that abyss, I told myself the same thing: I am doing this for them. I did it for Sarah, my wife, whose smile used to light up the darkest corners of my life. I did it for Mark, my younger brother, who always seemed to find himself in debt, looking to me to bail him out. I took the most dangerous shifts, the ones with the highest hazard pay, just to secure our future. I wanted to pay off the mortgage. I wanted to start a college fund for the kids we planned to have. I wanted to come home a hero, not because I died, but because I had sacrificed my sanity to build us a castle. The journey back was a blur of exhaustion and adrenaline. The helicopter ride from the rig to the mainland, the long-haul flight across the Atlantic, and finally the train ride that rattled my bones. I hadn't told them I was coming. I wanted it to be a surprise. I had played the scene over and over in my head 1,000 times during those lonely nights in the decompression chamber. I imagined walking through the front door, dropping my heavy duffel bag, and seeing Sarah's face transform from confusion to pure joy. I imagined the tears, the hugs, the smell of her vanilla perfume burying the scent of salt and oil that clung to my skin. I had almost $200,000 saved up in an offshore account they didn't have access to yet, my big surprise. I felt like Santa Claus returning with a sack full of dreams, but as the train pulled into the station of my hometown, a strange heaviness settled in my stomach. It wasn't the butterflies of excitement, it was something colder. A primal instinct, maybe. The sky was a bruised purple, heavy with rain, and the town looked different. Grayer, more hostile. I stepped onto the platform, the cool evening air biting at my cheeks. I pulled my phone out. I had tried calling Sarah from the airport, but it went straight to voicemail. "Hi, you've reached Sarah, leave a message." Her voice sounded cheerful, normal. I tried Mark next. Voicemail. I tried my mother, voicemail. Maybe they're all together, I whispered to myself, trying to shake off the paranoia. Maybe they're planning a surprise party for me. Maybe someone leaked that I was coming home. I flagged down a taxi. The driver was an old man with cataracts and a cap pulled low. He didn't look at me, just grunted when I gave him the address. As we drove through the familiar streets, I looked out the window. The town hadn't changed, but I had. The isolation of the ocean changes a man. It makes you sensitive to vibrations, to the shifts in the current. And right now the current felt wrong, deadly wrong. The taxi dropped me off a few blocks from my house. I wanted to walk the rest of the way, to stretch my legs and breathe in the air of home. But first I needed coffee. My head was pounding from the jet lag, and I felt like I was walking through a thick fog. I ducked into Joe's Diner, a place I had been going to since I was a teenager. It was empty, save for a waitress wiping down the counter and a couple of truckers in the back. I sat on a stool, the red vinyl cracked and peeling. It felt grounding. Real. "Just a black coffee, please," I said, my voice raspy. The waitress turned around. It was Brenda. She had known me for years. She looked at me, her eyes widening slightly, but she didn't smile. She didn't say, "Hey, stranger, long time no see." She just stared, her face pale, like she was looking right through me. "Brenda?" I asked, forcing a smile. "It's me. I know I look a bit rough around the edges, haven't shaved in a week, but come on." She blinked rapidly, her hand shaking as she reached for the pot. "Here you go, hun," she said, her voice barely a whisper. She poured the coffee, spilling a little onto the saucer. She didn't make eye contact. She turned around quickly and busied herself with the coffee machine, her back rigid. Weird, I thought. Maybe she's having a bad day. I took a sip of the bitter liquid. It burned my tongue, waking me up. I pulled my phone out again, still no texts, no missed calls. It had been 24 hours since I landed on the continent. I had sent a text saying, "Almost there," but it remained unread. A sense of dread began to crawl up my spine, cold and spindly like a spider. Why was everyone ignoring me? Was there an emergency? Was someone sick? I looked around the diner again. On the counter near the register was a stack of today's local newspapers, the Daily Gazette. I reached over and grabbed one, thinking I'd check the local sports scores, maybe see how the high school football team was doing. Anything to distract me from the gnawing anxiety in my gut. I flipped past the front page, politics, potholes, a new mal opening. I turned to page 3. And that's when the world stopped spinning. The sound of the diner, the hum of the refrigerator, the clinking of dishes, faded into a high-pitched ringing in my ears. I felt the blood drain from my face, leaving me cold and dizzy. There it was, page 3, the obituary section. It took up a quarter of the page, a premium spot, expensive, and looking back at me was my own face. I read the text, my lips moving silently, trying to comprehend words that shouldn't exist. It is with heavy hearts that the family of David Miller announces his tragic passing. David, a beloved husband, brother and son, was lost at sea on Tuesday following a catastrophic equipment failure on the deep-sea rig Titan. Despite extensive search efforts, his body was not recovered. I gripped the counter. Tuesday I was on a plane over the Atlantic. I wasn't on the rig. I had clocked out 3 days early because I had finished the contract ahead of schedule. I was alive. I was right here. I read on, bile rising in my throat. David was a hero who always put others before himself. He leaves behind his grieving wife Sarah and his brother Mark. A memorial service will be held today at 4:00 p.m. at St. Jude's Chapel to honor his memory and say our final goodbyes. Today, 4:00 p.m. I looked at the clock on the wall. It was 3:15 p.m. No, I whispered. This is a mistake, this is a sick joke. But then the pieces started to click together, the unanswered calls. The weird look Brenda gave me, she didn't think I was a ghost. She probably just didn't recognize me with the beard, or maybe she hadn't seen the paper yet. Or maybe she thought she was seeing a dead man walking. Lost at sea, I muttered. Body not recovered. That was the key. No body meant no autopsy. No autopsy meant no questions. And accidental death on an oil rig, that triggered the double indemnity clause in my life insurance policy. I had signed that policy 2 years ago at Mark's insistence. It's dangerous work, Dave, he had said. You need to protect Sarah if something happens. I trusted him, I trusted her. The policy was worth $2 million, $4 million if it was an accident, $4 million. My hands crumpled the newspaper into a tight ball. The love I had felt on the train, the warm fuzzy feeling of being Santa Claus, evaporated instantly. In its place a dark, volcanic rage began to bubble. They weren't grieving, they weren't crying, they were cashing in. They thought I was thousands of feet underwater, fish food, erased from existence. They thought they had committed the perfect crime. I stood up, the stool screeching against the floor. I threw a $20 bill on the counter, not waiting for change. Brenda, I said, my voice low and terrifyingly calm. She turned around, startled. Keep the change, I said. And if anyone asks, you never saw me. I walked out of the diner and into the rain. The shock was fading, replaced by a cold, tactical clarity. I wasn't going to run to the police, not yet. The police would take statements, file reports, drag this out. No, I checked my watch, 3:20 p.m. I had 40 minutes to get to St. Jude's Chapel, 40 minutes to prepare for the performance of a lifetime. They wanted a funeral. Fine, I would give them a funeral they would never forget. I hailed another taxi. Where to? The driver asked. I looked at him in the rearview mirror, my eyes hard as flint. St. Jude's Chapel, I said, and step on it. I don't want to be late for my own burial. The taxi idled at the curb, the windshield wipers slapping back and forth like a metronome, counting down the seconds of my former life. St. Jude's Chapel loomed ahead, a Gothic structure of grey stone and stained glass that seemed to weep in the relentless rain. It was a place I knew well. I had been baptized here. I had married Sarah here. And now, supposedly, I was leaving the world from here. You gonna get out, pal? The driver asked, eyeing me in the mirror. He probably thought I was a grieving relative paralyzed by sorrow, if only he knew. Yeah, I croaked. Keep the meter running, I might need a quick getaway. I pulled the collar of my heavy canvas jacket up around my ears. I hadn't shaved in a week, and the exhaustion of the rig was etched into the dark circles under my eyes. I pulled a black beanie low over my forehead. To anyone glancing quickly, I was just another mourner, or maybe a drifter seeking shelter from the storm. I was invisible. I was a ghost. I stepped out onto the wet pavement. The parking lot was full. I recognized the cars. There was my best friend Mike's battered pickup truck. There was my Aunt Linda's sedan. And there, parked right in the front in the spot reserved for the immediate family, was a brand new, sleek black Range Rover. It still had the temporary dealer plates. My stomach twisted into a knot. We didn't own a Range Rover. We drove a 5-year-old Honda that needed a new transmission. That car cost easily $80,000. My body wasn't even cold. Hell, it wasn't even found, and they were already spending the money. I walked toward the heavy oak doors, keeping my head down. The rain mixed with the sweat on my neck. I didn't go in through the main entrance where the usher was handing out programs. Instead, I circled around to the side entrance, a small door used by the choir and the maintenance staff. It was usually locked, but I knew the trick. You had to lift the handle slightly before turning. It clicked. Open. I slipped inside, the smell of rain instantly replaced by the cloying, suffocating scent of lilies and beeswax. The air was cool and still, heavy with the weight of performative silence. I could hear the muffled sounds of the organ playing a mournful hymn, Amazing Grace. How cliché. I crept up the narrow, spiraling staircase that led to the choir loft. It was empty today. They must have hired a soloist or used a recording. From up here I had a bird's-eye view of the entire sanctuary. I was God looking down on the sinners, and down there in the front row sat the architects of my destruction. I crouched behind the wooden railing, peering through the gaps in the balustrade. The church was packed. It was touching in a sick way to see how many people had turned up. My high school football coach was there, wiping his eyes with a handkerchief. My old diving crew, guys I had trained with years ago, sat in the back looking uncomfortable in their suits. These people were hurting, their grief was real, they were mourning a friend, a teammate, a good man, and then there was the center of attention, the altar. A large, polished mahogany casket sat on a pedestal, draped in a spray of white roses that probably cost more than my first car. It was closed, of course. A closed casket for a man lost at sea. It was a prop, an empty box. I wondered what they had put inside to give it weight. Sandbags, bricks, or was it just full of empty air like their promises? Next to the casket was a large easel holding a blown-up portrait of me. It was a photo Sarah had taken on our honeymoon in Hawaii. I looked tan, happy, holding a cocktail. I looked like a man who had his whole life ahead of him. Seeing it made my throat constrict. That man was dead. They had killed him not by drowning him in the ocean, but by drowning him in treachery. My eyes shifted to the front pew. There was Sarah. She was wearing a black dress that fit her perfectly, too perfectly. It was a designer cut, elegant and sharp. A black veil covered her face, but I could see her shoulders shaking. She was leaning into Mark, my brother. Mark. He was wearing a suit that I had never seen before, something Italian, tailored to hide his slight paunch. He had his arm around Sarah, patting her shoulder in a rhythm that looked practiced. Pat, pat, pause, pat, pat, pause. He looked solemn, stoic. The protective younger brother stepping up to fill the void. To the outside world it was a tableau of tragedy, the grieving widow and the supportive brother, but from my vantage point in the shadows I saw the cracks. I saw Mark check his watch, a heavy gold Rolex that caught the dim light of the church. He checked it twice in the span of a minute, as if he had somewhere better to be. As if this funeral was just an inconvenient meeting he had to sit through before the payout cleared. I saw Sarah reach into her purse for a tissue. When she pulled her hand out, I saw the glint of a bracelet, diamond tennis bracelet, new. I knew every piece of jewelry she owned because I had bought them all. This was something else. This was an advance on my death benefit. I felt a growl building in my chest, a primal sound that I had to bite my tongue to suppress. They weren't just fraudsters, they were grave robbers. They were looting my life while my friends cried over an empty box. The organ music faded, leaving a silence so thick it felt like it would crush the breath out of me. The priest, Father Thomas, an old man who had baptized me, stepped up to the pulpit. He spoke about the fragility of life, about the mystery of God's plan. He spoke about the sea claiming its own. But we are not here to dwell on the darkness of the deep, Father Thomas intoned, his voice echoing off the stone walls. We are here to celebrate the light that David brought into our lives. And to speak on that light, I invite his brother Mark to say a few words. Mark stood up. He buttoned his jacket, a smooth, confident gesture. He walked to the podium, head bowed, playing the role of the reluctant, heartbroken sibling to perfection. He gripped the sides of the lectern, looking out at the crowd. David was, Mark started, his voice cracking. He paused, cleared his throat. David was my hero. He was the one who always fixed things. When our dad left, David became the man of the house. He worked the jobs nobody else wanted. He went into the dark, cold water so that we could stay warm and safe. I gripped the railing so hard my knuckles turned white. I did exactly that, and this is how you repay me. Mark continued. He told me just before he left for this last trip. He said, Mark, take care of Sarah if anything happens. It was like he knew, like he had a premonition. Liar, I screamed inside my head. I never said that. I told him to stop gambling online. That was our last conversation. "And I promise you, David," Mark said, looking up at the ceiling, right towards where I was hiding though he couldn't see me, "I will take care of her, we will be okay. We will survive this tragedy because that's what you would have wanted. You left us with a legacy of love and security." Security, that was the code word, money. Mark stepped down, wiping a fake tear from his eye. He hugged Sarah as he sat down and she stood up. "Sarah, my Sarah." She walked to the podium slowly, clutching a crumpled tissue. She looked small, fragile. She lifted the veil. Her face was red, blotchy. For a second I wavered. Maybe she didn't know. Maybe Mark had set this all up and tricked her too. "I don't know how to exist in a world without David," she whispered into the microphone. A ripple of sympathy went through the crowd. "He was my anchor, my North Star. We had so many plans. We were going to buy a house by the lake. We were going to start a family." She sobbed, a wrenching sound that tore at my heart, but then she looked down at her notes and for a split second the mask slipped. She smoothed the paper with her hand, and I saw her eyes dart toward the insurance agent sitting in the third row, a man named Mr. Henderson. I recognized him from the paperwork. She made eye contact with him, a subtle nod. A tiny, almost imperceptible tightening of her jaw that signaled determination, not grief. It was a look that said, "Did I do good? Is the money safe?" Then she looked back up, tears flowing again. "But I know he is watching us. I know he is here with us right now." A cold chill went through me. "You have no idea, honey," I whispered into the darkness of the choir loft. "I am here, and I've seen enough." The rage that had been hot and volcanic cooled into something solid. Something sharp. I was done watching. I was done hurting. The script they had written for this day was about to undergo a massive rewrite. I stood up from my crouch. I took off the beanie. I unzipped my jacket. Below me, the service was moving towards the final commendation. Father Thomas was sprinkling holy water on the empty casket. The irony was suffocating. I walked to the stairs. My boots were heavy, steel-toed. They would make a loud, echoing clatter on the stone floor of the nave. It was time to make my entrance. I backed away from the balcony railing, the wood creaking softly under my weight. Down below, the service was reaching its crescendo. The choir had started singing again, a soft, haunting rendition of "Abide With Me." It was the song my mother used to hum when I was a kid. Hearing it now, weaponized to manipulate a room full of people into feeling sorry for my murderers, made my skin crawl. I turned and headed down the spiral staircase. My movements were mechanical, precise. I was no longer the confused husband standing in a diner. I was a diver preparing for a dangerous descent. My breathing was controlled, in through the nose, out through the mouth. I needed my heart rate low. I needed to be sharp. At the bottom of the stairs, I found myself in the vestibule, the small foyer between the outside world and the main sanctuary. The air here was colder, swirling with the draft coming from the main entrance where the ushers had fled to smoke cigarettes or escape the gloom. It was empty now, just me and the two massive, leather-padded doors that separated the living from the dead. I could hear Father Thomas's voice through the thick wood, muffled but rhythmic. "Let us pray for David's eternal soul." Eternal soul, I thought bitterly. You should be praying for the souls of the people in the front row. I looked at my reflection in the glass of a donation box mounted on the wall. I looked wild. My hair was matted with rain, my beard was thick and unkempt, and my eyes looked like two burning coals in a skull. I didn't look like David Miller, the friendly neighborhood fix-it guy. I looked like a wraith dragged up from the bottom of the trench. I reached out and touched the brass handles of the double doors. They were cool to the touch. This was the threshold. Once I crossed it, there was no going back. The David they knew would be gone forever. The trust, the marriage, the brotherhood, it would all shatter the moment these doors opened. But they had already shattered it. They had taken a hammer to my life the moment they signed that insurance claim. I was just here to sweep up the glass. I took 3 steps back. I wanted momentum. I didn't want to just open the door. I wanted to announce my arrival with the force of a natural disaster. I wanted them to feel the shockwave before they even saw my face. I clenched my fists. I thought of the cold, dark nights in the saturation chamber. I thought of the fake tears on Sarah's face. I thought of the Range Rover. I sprinted. I hit the double doors with a flying kick, putting every ounce of my 200 pounds into the center seam. The sound was thunderous. It didn't sound like wood hitting wood. It sounded like a gunshot, a cannon blast that echoed off the vaulted stone ceiling and instantly silenced the organ, the choir, and the weeping. The heavy doors flew outward. slamming against the interior walls with a violent crack that shook the dust from the rafters. A gust of wind from the open vestibule howled into the church, carrying the smell of rain and ozone, causing the candles on the altar to flicker wildly. Some of them blew out instantly, plunging the front of the church into sudden, erratic shadows. I stood there in the doorway, framed by the grey light of the storm behind me. I didn't move. I let the visual sink in. For 3 seconds there was absolute paralyzed silence. It was the kind of silence you hear after a car crash before the screaming starts. 300 heads turned simultaneously, necks craned, people gasped, the sound sucking the air out of the room. I saw Mrs. Higgins in the back row drop her hymn book. It hit the floor with a flat thud that seemed incredibly loud. I stepped forward. Clomp. My heavy work boot hit the marble floor of the central aisle. Clomp. I walked with a heavy, deliberate gait. I wasn't rushing. I was the inevitable. Is that? Someone whispered. Oh my God, another voice trembled. A woman in the middle row screamed, a short, sharp shriek of pure terror. She thought she was seeing a ghost, and in a way she was. I kept my eyes locked forward. I didn't look at the friends. I didn't look at the confused priest who had frozen with his hand mid-blessing. I had tunnel vision. My target was the altar. My target was the 2 people whose backs had stiffened, who hadn't turned around yet because they were too terrified to look. Mark and Sarah. I saw Mark's shoulders rise. He was freezing up. The fight-or-flight response was kicking in and he was choosing freeze. Sarah slowly, agonizingly began to turn her head. I saw her profile. Her face was no longer the mask of tragic beauty. It was a mask of absolute horror. Her mouth hung open, slack, her eyes wide enough to show the whites all around. It was the look of a gambler who had bet the house on a sure thing and just watched the roulette wheel land on 0. I stopped halfway down the aisle. The acoustics of the church were designed to carry a whisper to the back row. I didn't need to shout. I let my arms hang loose by my sides, standing tall, water dripping from my jacket onto the pristine floor. Sorry I'm late, I said, my voice rough, gravelly, and echoing off the stone walls. The traffic coming back from the dead was a nightmare. The shock in the room broke. The murmur turned into a roar of confusion. People were standing up, pointing, clutching their chests. David, Father Thomas stammered from the pulpit, his face as white as his vestments. David, is that you, by the grace of God? I ignored him. I kept walking. I reached the front of the church, the holy ground where my empty coffin sat. I walked right up to it. I ran my hand along the polished mahogany wood. It was smooth, expensive. Nice box, I said, looking at Mark. He had finally turned around. He looked like he was going to vomit. His expensive Italian suit suddenly looked like a costume on a child. He was shaking, his hands gripping the back of the pew in front of him so hard his knuckles were purple. Dave, Mark squeaked. It was a pathetic sound. Dave, we thought. You thought what, Mark? I interrupted, stepping closer to him. The smell of his expensive cologne mixed with the smell of my own sweat and rain. You thought I was fish food. You thought I was gone for good. I turned my gaze to Sarah. She was paralyzed, slumped in the pew. The diamond bracelet on her wrist glittered under the church lights, a beacon of her guilt. She couldn't even look me in the eye. She was staring at my boots, trembling so violently her teeth were chattering. Sarah, I said softly. The use of her name made her flinch as if I had slapped her. David, she whispered, tears streaming down her face, real tears this time, tears of fear. We. The company said, the telegram. Save it, I snapped, my voice rising, finally letting the anger bleed out. I've been standing in the back, I heard the speeches, I heard the eulogies. I turned to face the congregation, standing in front of the altar, blocking their view of the fake coffin. I spread my arms wide. I have to say, I addressed the crowd, my voice booming now, it's a hell of a thing to attend your own funeral. You really find out who your friends are, and you really find out who your family is. I spun back around to face the dynamic duo. I leaned in close, putting my hands on the back of the pew, trapping them in their seats. I saw the Range Rover outside Mark, nice wheels. Mark flinched. I saw the bracelet, Sarah, very sparkly. Sarah sobbed, putting her face in her hands. But here's the question, I said, dropping my voice to a lethal whisper that only they and the first few rows could hear. If I'm standing here, and that box is empty, then who exactly are you crying for? I looked past them to the third row, to Mr. Henderson, the insurance agent. He was standing up now, his briefcase clutched to his chest, his eyes darting between me and the widow. He was a smart man. He did math for a living. and he had just calculated that something was severely, criminally wrong. I pointed a dirty finger at him. "You," I said, "Mr. Henderson, right, from Safe Harbor Life Insurance." He nodded, unable to speak. "I think we need to talk," I said, a dark smile spreading across my face, "because it looks like there's been a miracle. Or—" I looked back at my wife and brother whose lives were dissolving before their eyes. "Or an attempted felony." I turned back to Mark and Sarah. I leaned in until my nose was almost touching Mark's. "Did you miss me?" I asked. Mark didn't answer. He couldn't. He just stared at me, and in his eyes I saw the reflection of the jail cell doors slamming shut. The church was dead silent again, but the energy had shifted. It wasn't sadness anymore. It was the electric, crackling atmosphere of a crime scene. "Well," I shouted, slamming my hand onto the pew wood, making them both jump. "Did you miss me?" Sarah screamed, burying her face in Mark's shoulder. Mark looked around wildly for an exit, but there was nowhere to go. The resurrection was complete. Now the judgment began. The silence that followed my question, "Did you miss me?" was broken not by my family, but by the squeak of leather shoes on marble. Mr. Henderson, the insurance agent, stepped out of the pew. He was a small man with wire-rimmed glasses and a suit that cost more than a month of my salary, but right now, he looked like a predator sensing blood in the water. He didn't look at me with fear anymore. He looked at me with the calculating gaze of a man who realizes his quarterly bonus was about to be saved. He walked past the frozen congregation, past the weeping Sarah, and stood next to me. We formed an unlikely alliance, the dead husband and the corporate suit, two men cheated by the same lie. "Mr. Miller," Henderson said, his voice steady but tight with controlled anger, "I must say you are remarkably well preserved for a man who was reported as—" What was the phrasing on the claim form? "Pulverized by deep-sea pressure." "I'm a tough guy to kill, Mr. Henderson," I replied, not taking my eyes off Mark. Mark was sweating so much now that his hair was plastered to his forehead. He looked like a cornered rat. Henderson opened his briefcase. The sound of the latches clicking open, snap, snap, echoed like gunshots in the quiet church. He pulled out a file folder. It was thick. "Mrs. Miller," Henderson said, turning to Sarah, "and Mr. Mark Miller. According to the sworn affidavit you both signed on Tuesday morning, you received confirmation of death from the rig supervisor at 8:00 a.m. Is that correct?" Sarah sobbed into her hands, muttering unintelligible noises. "Answer him," I roared, making them jump. "Yes." Mark shouted back, his voice cracking. "Yes, we did. We got a call. It was a bad connection. They said Dave was gone. We just did what we thought was right." "Interesting," Henderson said, adjusting his glasses. He pulled a piece of paper from the file. "Because I have the claim timestamp here. You filed the electronic claim at 9:15 a.m. That is 1 hour and 15 minutes after you supposedly found out your husband and brother died." A murmur went through the crowd. People were whispering, "1 hour, who files for insurance an hour after a tragedy?" "We were in shock," Mark stammered, waving his hands. "We were panicked about the mortgage. We wanted to make sure Sarah was safe." "Safe," I laughed. It was a dry, humorless sound. "Mark, you didn't even call my phone. I checked my logs. No missed calls from you. No missed calls from Sarah on Tuesday. You didn't try to verify it. You didn't call the Coast Guard. You called the bank." I took a step closer to the altar. "And you know what else is interesting, Mr. Henderson?" I asked, looking at the agent. "I wasn't even on the rig on Tuesday. I clocked out on Sunday. I was in a hotel in London on a layover." If they had called the rig, the supervisor would have told them I was already on my way home. Henderson's eyes narrowed behind his lenses. He looked at Sarah. "That constitutes wire fraud, Mrs. Miller, and insurance fraud. And since the payout you requested and expedited was over $2 million, we are talking about a federal felony." Sarah let out a wail, grabbing Mark's arm. "You said they wouldn't check. You said it was airtight." "Shut up, Sarah," Mark hissed, shoving her away. The mask of the loving family was completely gone now. They were turning on each other. "But there's still one thing that bothers me," I said, turning my back on them and facing the coffin again. The mahogany box gleamed under the church lights. It was the centerpiece of the fraud. It was the prop that made it all real for the crying friends in the back. "The obituary said body not recovered," I said loud enough for the back row to hear. "So, Father Thomas—" I looked at the priest, who was clutching his rosary as if it could ward off the madness unfolding in his church. "Father, why is there a casket?" I asked. "Well," the priest stammered, "Mark and Sarah insisted. They said they wanted a focal point for the grief. They said they placed some of your personal effects inside, to say goodbye. Personal effects, I repeated. That's touching. I walked up to the casket, I placed my hands on the lid. Don't, Mark shrieked. He lunged forward, scrambling over the pew. You can't open that, it's sacred, it's part of the ceremony. My old diving buddy, Mike, a guy the size of a vending machine, stood up from the second row. He had been watching the whole thing with his mouth open, but now his face was dark with anger. He stepped into the aisle and blocked Mark's path with a single, massive arm. Sit down, Mark, Mike growled. Let the man see his own coffin. Mark bounced off Mike's arm and collapsed back onto the bench, defeated. I looked at Sarah. She was shaking her head frantically, mouthing no, no, no. I unlatched the lid. Click, click. The hinges were well oiled. I lifted the heavy mahogany top. The crowd held its breath. Everyone leaned forward. What was inside? My old clothes, photos. I threw the lid all the way back. Inside, resting on the white satin pillow, were 6 bags of concrete mix. Quikrete, £50 each. The church erupted. It wasn't just murmurs anymore, it was outrage. People stood up shouting. Are you kidding me? Someone yelled. Sick. Another screamed. I reached in and patted one of the concrete bags. Heavy, I said into the microphone that was still attached to the lectern nearby. About the same weight as a man. Good for carrying a pallbearer's illusion. Bad for a soul. I turned to Henderson. He was scribbling furiously in his notebook. Evidence, I said, pointing to the bags. They didn't just fake a death, they staged a funeral. They stood here in front of God and my friends and cried over a pile of construction material. I looked at the spray of white roses on top of the lid. And knowing Mark, I added, he probably put the concrete on my credit card. The humiliation was complete, but I wasn't done. I needed to twist the knife. I needed to make sure everyone understood the timeline. I pulled my phone out of my pocket. I scrolled to a photo I had taken just 3 hours ago. Mr. Henderson, I said. You saw the Range Rover outside. Black model, HSE Luxury Edition. Sticker price roughly $90,000, Henderson recited instantly. I noticed the dealer plates. Sarah, I said, walking over to where she sat huddled. Can you tell the congregation when you bought that car? She didn't answer. I can tell you, I said. I called the dealership on the way here. The sale was finalized yesterday. Wednesday, 1 day after I died. You didn't even wait for the memorial service. You didn't even wait for the ink to dry on the obituary. I turned to the crowd, my voice breaking for the first time. The anger was giving way to the sheer heartbreak of it all. I was out there, I said, gesturing vaguely towards the ocean. I was freezing in the dark, breathing recycled air, eating canned food. I was saving every penny. I thought we were building a life. I looked at my friends in the crowd. I thought I had a home to come back to, but I didn't. I was just a paycheck to them. A lottery ticket that they decided to cash in early. Mark stood up again. He looked desperate, manic. It's not like that, Dave. We were going to invest it. We were going to set up a trust. It was for the family. The family. I stepped right up to him. Mark, you're 40 years old. You owe 50 grand to bookies in the city. I know about it. I was going to pay it off when I got home. That's why I took the extra shifts. Mark's face went slack. The color drained out of him completely. You were going to pay it, he whispered. Yes, I said softly, because you're my brother and I loved you. The past tense hung in the air like smoke. Loved, not love, but now, I stepped back. Now you're just a felon. At that moment, the wail of sirens cut through the sound of the rain outside. Blue and red lights began to flash against the stained glass windows, casting chaotic, violent shadows across the sanctuary. Mr. Henderson closed his briefcase with a final snap. I called the police when you walked in, Mr. Miller, Henderson said calmly. Standard protocol when a fraud of this magnitude is interrupted. I believe they are waiting outside. I looked at Sarah. She had stopped crying. She was just staring at the wall, catatonic. She knew it was over. The house, the car, the money, the husband, all gone. I looked at the open doors of the church. The rain was still falling. Well, I said, adjusting my collar, I guess this service is concluded. I walked down the steps of the altar, past the bags of concrete, past the ruin of my marriage. I didn't look back at them. I walked toward the main aisle. The crowd parted for me like the Red Sea. Hands reached out to touch my shoulder, voices whispered apologies, but I kept walking. I had one more act to perform. I had to hand my family over to the law. The heavy oak doors of St. Jude's, which I had kicked open only minutes before, were now flooded with a chaotic, strobing mixture of red and blue light. The sanctity of the church had been breached, not by a ghost, but by the relentless machinery of the law. 2 uniformed officers stepped into the vestibule, shaking the rain from their yellow slickers. Behind them, a detective in a trench coat, Detective Miller, no relation, ironically, scanned the room. The air inside the church, previously thick with incense and lies, was now sharp with the static crackle of police radios. Dispatch, we have eyes on the subjects. Situation is confused but controlled. I stood in the center aisle, an island in the middle of the storm. The congregation had pushed back into the pews, creating a wide berth. They looked from me to the police, then to the altar, their faces a mixture of fear and insatiable curiosity. This was better than any sermon they had ever heard. This was the wrath of God in real time. Mr. Henderson waved the officers down. He looked like a general commanding his troops. "Officers," he called out, his voice cutting through the murmurs. "Up here, the fraud is in progress. We have the claimants and—" he gestured to the open casket with the concrete bags. "We have the evidence." The police moved fast. Their boots thudded heavily on the carpeted runner of the aisle. It was a jarring sound in a place of worship, the sound of force. I watched Mark. He had stopped looking for an exit. He was slumped on the bench, his head in his hands, his body rocking back and forth. He looked like a child who had broken a vase and was waiting for the belt. The arrogance, the smooth talking, the man of the house bravado, it had all evaporated, leaving behind the small, weak man I had spent my life protecting. Sarah was different. She was staring at the police with wide, frantic eyes. She was hyperventilating. I could hear her gasping for air, a sharp, wheezing sound. She looked at the diamond bracelet on her wrist, then tried to unclasp it. Her fingers fumbled with the latch, desperate to hide the evidence, to dissociate herself from the money she had stolen. Click. The bracelet fell to the floor, sliding under the pew. "It's too late for that, Sarah," I said, my voice low but carrying in the silence. She looked up at me, her eyes streaming with fresh tears. "David, tell them it was a misunderstanding. Tell them we were grief-stricken. Please, I'm your wife." "You're not my wife," I replied, feeling a strange numbness in my chest. "My wife died the moment you signed that paper. You're just a stranger with my last name." The officers reached the front. One of them, a burly sergeant, looked into the coffin. He whistled low. "Quikrete," the sergeant muttered. "That's a new one, usually it's just empty." He turned to Mark. "Stand up, son." Mark didn't move. I said, "Stand up." The officer barked, reaching out and grabbing Mark by the lapel of his expensive Italian suit. He hauled my brother to his feet. Mark was limp, a ragdoll of despair. "Turn around, hands behind your back." The sound of the handcuffs ratcheting shut, ZZZZ zip click, was the most satisfying sound I had ever heard. It was the sound of the ledger finally balancing. They moved to Sarah next. She didn't go quietly. No, you don't understand," she screamed, backing away until she hit the altar railing. She knocked over a vase of flowers, the water splashing across the marble floor. "He's alive, look, he's right there, there's no murder, you can't arrest me if he's alive." Detective Miller stepped forward, calm and weary. "Ma'am, you're not being arrested for murder," he said, pulling a pair of cuffs from his belt. "You're being arrested for insurance fraud, wire fraud, and filing a false police report. The fact that your husband is alive is the only reason you aren't looking at life in prison. Now give me your hands." She struggled, flailing her arms. It took 2 officers to restrain her. When the metal cuffs locked around her wrists, she let out a wail that echoed up to the rafters, a sound of pure, selfish misery. It wasn't regret. It was the agony of getting caught. "David," she screamed as they began to lead her away. "David, help me, don't let them take me, I love you, I did it for us." I stood still as a statue at the end of the front pew. I didn't look away, I owed it to myself to watch this. They began the long walk down the center aisle, the walk of shame. Every head in the church turned to watch them pass. These were the people they had tried to fool, the neighbors they had lied to, the friends they had manipulated for sympathy casseroles and donations. Mrs. Gable, the town librarian, shook her head in disgust as Sarah passed. My old football coach spat on the floor near Mark's feet. The community wasn't just shocked, they were offended. They had wasted their tears on these grifters. As they drew level with me, the officer holding Sarah's arm slowed down for a second, perhaps sensing the gravity of the moment. Sarah stopped. She looked at me. Her mascara was running in black streaks down her face. She looked old, ruined. "Dave," she whispered. "What are you going to do?" I looked her in the eye. I searched for any spark of the woman I had fallen in love with 10 years ago. The woman I had laughed with, the woman I had built a life with. but there was nothing there. Just a hollow shell filled with greed. I'm going to go get a burger, I said calmly, and then I'm going to live my life, my real life. But the house, she sobbed, the accounts, the lawyers will handle it, I said. Enjoy the ride, Sarah. I hear the backseat of a squad car is very spacious. I looked at Mark. He couldn't even meet my gaze. He was staring at the floor, his face burning red. Goodbye, Mark, I said. Don't drop the soap. The officers pushed them forward. Go. I watched them walk all the way to the back of the church, through the vestibule and out into the rainy night. The blue lights swirled one last time, illuminating their silhouettes in the doorway, and then they were gone. The doors swung shut with a heavy, final thud. The church was quiet again, but the air felt lighter, cleaner. The poison had been drawn out. For a long moment nobody moved. The congregation sat in stunned silence, processing the drama they had just witnessed. Then, slowly, the spell broke. Mike, my diving buddy, walked up the aisle. He looked at me, then at the bags of concrete, then back at me. A slow grin spread across his bearded face. You crazy son of a gun, Mike said, clapping a massive hand on my shoulder. You really know how to make an entrance. I try, I said, feeling the adrenaline finally start to crash. My knees felt weak. You got a cigarette, Mike? For you, I got the whole pack. We walked out of the church together, leaving the murmuring crowd behind. I didn't want their apologies. I didn't want their handshakes or their confused questions. Not yet. We stepped out onto the stone steps of St. Jude S. The rain had stopped. The storm had passed, leaving the air smelling of wet pavement and ozone. The clouds were breaking apart, revealing a few faint stars. The police cruisers were pulling away, their sirens wailing in the distance, fading like a bad dream. I took the cigarette Mike offered and lit it. The smoke filled my lungs, grounding me. So, Mike said, leaning against a stone pillar, you're legally dead. You got no wife. You got no brother, and you probably got a mess of paperwork to fix this. I exhaled a long plume of smoke. Yeah, what now? Mike asked. You gonna go back to the rig? I looked at the streetlights reflecting in the puddles. I thought about the $200,000 in my offshore account. I thought about the $4 million they tried to steal. I thought about the freedom of having absolutely nothing left to lose. No, I said. The rig is done, that life is done. So where to? I looked up at the moon, peering through the clouds. I don't know, I said, and for the first time in years a genuine smile touched my lips. And that's the best part, I can go anywhere, I can be anyone. I flicked the cigarette butt into a puddle. They tried to bury me, Mike, I said, turning to my friend. But they forgot one thing. What's that? I'm a diver, I said. I know how to hold my breath until I reach the surface. I buttoned my jacket. Come on, let's get that burger. I'm starving. We walked down the steps and into the night, leaving the empty coffin and the shattered lies behind us. I was David Miller. I had walked into my own funeral, and I had walked out the other side. And as I walked down the street, feeling the cool wind on my face, I realized something profound. Today wasn't my funeral, it was my rebirth.